Welcome to another edition of Beyond History. I'm Ken Trahan, and we're so glad that you've taken time to join us here today. And today we're going to continue our study of the record of the rocks. That's right, the rocks. Living, breathing, real. We'll do so with Dr. Don Patton in just a moment when Beyond History continues. Welcome to another edition of Beyond History. Ken Trahan, joined by Dr. Don Patton. It's great to have you back, Don. And
thank you, sir.
Welcome to the show. And of course, we've discussed all the different aspects of what you do and where you've been. And those are vast travels and vast studies. And we'll get into the vastness of the record of rocks, part two, as it were, today. When we discussed this topic with you initially, we got into living fossils and whether or not dinosaurs and man coexisted. And of course, as you talked about, living fossils are alive and well and still examining. And yes, you absolutely believe that man and dinosaur were together at one time.
Absolutely, which shouldn't surprise a creationist. If they're created in 6 days, what's the problem? It's the idea that they evolved over millions of years that would indicate they ought not to be together. But then, of course, when you find them together, that's what blows up the concept.
And you talked about this previously too, but you know, when you get the evidence presented and you see people talking about, well, they could not have possibly existed, then you see footprints and things of this nature, you have something to point to, and yet still they try to find some issue with that.
It's almost comical. We had the curator of the Dallas Museum of Natural History been there for 30 years. Came down and looked at the footprints at Glen Rose, and about the third time down, he said, Dr. Patton, I've got an explanation for you. I can explain these footprints that look like humans. He said, I think they were made by aliens. I run into this fairly often on the college campus, and I said, well, now, Chuck, if they're made by aliens, they're from a galaxy far, far away, and probably more advanced than we are. What are they doing running around barefooted? You know? He got mad. That was the end of that conversation. But you got the explanation of dinosaurs with human feet and aliens, and it's fun to be a creationist. You just go with the evidence. There it is.
Professors,
maybe it's what it looks like.
Sure. Professors, for the most part, you find them to be anti in this regard, or do you find them to be open-minded? How do you see them?
A complete range.
Yeah.
I mean, professors are people. If they've got careers at stake, you see a lot of resistance and sensitivity. There's some to whom truth means more, and we'll see changes and dramatic changes pretty often, but not always. And that's not unlike what you see when you're studying scripture with somebody. You can show them the evidence. If they don't want to see it, it's no problem. They don't see it. If they're looking for the truth, they'll follow.
Might have something to do with where they're teaching and who's paying their bills, perhaps?
There's a very vicious opposition, more so than you could really imagine. And it's difficult to believe how vicious the opposition to creation is in academia, or at least in a good portion of it. Some just, well, their career's at stake. They like to feed their kids, and if this is threatened, then look out. Truth doesn't matter at that point.
Sure. Evidence when it comes to dinosaurs and humans being together in the United States. Is there evidence anywhere else in the world on this behalf?
And let me also say that most evolutionists teach what they've been taught. It's not that there's a diabolical evil situation. That's all they know. And when we show them the evidence, those are fairly easy to persuade. There are other types. But yes, around the world you see evidence in Peru and in Mexico and in France, for example. Down in Peru, we've spent a good bit of time there, dozens of trips, excavating in the Inca tombs. And Dr. Javier Cabrera who was 20 years head of the Department of Medicine at the University of Lima, retired to be cultural anthropologist of Inca, has been collecting the burial stones from the Inca tombs for the past 30 years. His father actually began before he did, and has collected over 11,000 of these burial stones with carvings on them. About a third of those carvings are just disgusting pornography, which was typical of that culture. Weren't made by young Earth creationists. But about a third of them have dinosaurs, very obvious, variety of species, different types of stones, different finishes, different style, some very even oriental, artistic, cartoonish, but very recognizable dinosaurs. And this is from 2,500 years ago. We're supposed to have known what dinosaurs looked like for maybe 100, 150. Didn't know very well 150, but they have beautiful representations. The Apatosaurus type is shown with the dermal frills on the back. When Mr. Sinclair made his sign, he didn't know they had dermal frills, but they did know 2,500 years ago down in Peru. I think that's excellent evidence. Now, there's a lot of slander and misrepresentation that I've heard, but we've been down there looking firsthand, talking to the people involved, and they continue to. Dr. Cabrera, who performed the first heart transplant in Peru, established the largest teaching medical hospital there. It was a great man. Has been slandered terribly because he found this. But then he passed away in 2002. Since then, they continue to be found. And I've got several of the stones that have been found since he passed away. I don't think he carved those.
So you talk about Mexico and Peru and France. What about the United States? What evidence are we talking about?
Let's go to Mexico.
Okay.
Central Highlands, in the state of Guanajuato, there in Acambaro. We have a collection of some 30,000 figurines. Waldemar Julsrud found those back in the early 1900s, and there are a wide range of people and animals and dinosaurs. About 10% of the 33,000 are of clear dinosaurs. These date by thermoluminescent dating about 4,000 years old. They're found with a culture, the Chupiquero culture, that is recognized to be 4,000 years old. And they're found in the same hole. And they'll acknowledge, well, this is, but then this can't be because humans and dinosaurs didn't live together. In fact, INA, the Institute of Archaeology, sent 4 archaeologists down to investigate and chose a spot 3 miles from where Julsrud had excavated and dug in their own spot, in their own hole, and found not only the Chupiquero figurines, but also the dinosaur figurines. These were real, these were not in the same hole in the spot they chose. They just cannot and will not acknowledge that. But I think the evidence is overwhelming. I took a professor of art in the University of Texas, Darlington, down with me. He looked at hundreds of these. He said there were at least 100 artists involved, not one person making them, as a few foolish individuals have claimed. And again, the variety of materials, the variety of styles and species is evident that just makes foolish the idea that one person faked it. It just doesn't work. I think it's excellent evidence that they were seeing dinosaurs and made figurines. Several have suggested that creatures, powerful creatures in Mesopotamia, lions and strong creatures, were buried under the doorstep to ward off evil spirits. They've got a fancy term for that. Well, if you're going to scare off evil spirits, dinosaurs do a pretty good job, I think. Mm-hmm. And they do seem to be found in clumps, perhaps where dwellings had been built over them.
And of course, there's France, and we'll talk about the U.S. We'll also talk about the evolutionist and his view of dinosaurs and humans as we continue in just a moment here on Beyond History with Dr. Don Patton. Welcome back to Beyond History. Ken Trahan with Dr. Don Patton talking about dinosaurs and humans being together as part of our rock discussion. And you talked about specific examples in Mexico and Peru, and I know you mentioned France earlier. Any particular instances you can point out there?
There are a number throughout Europe, but we've spent time in France recently. I had a young girl come back from a French trip in France and had a picture of a dinosaur on the wall of a castle that they had visited. I thought, well, that's interesting, and she didn't think about it until she heard us lecture about some of the footprints there in Texas. She brought the picture. It was sure looked like a dinosaur to me, so I took off to France. And there's one castle, Chateau de Chambord, down in the southern part of France. Over 700 dinosaurs carved on the walls of the castle. Wow. And it's built in the 12 and 1300s. We're supposed to have known what they looked like for maybe 100 years, and they were seeing them. It looks exactly like a Plateosaurus. You compare that with what you see in the Harvard Museum of Natural History. They've got a really good one. It's a dead ringer. And you see it over the fireplace. You see it in the throne room. You see it on the outside walls, carved in the desks. And I was able to obtain a huge chest from that area, and I have one in my den from early centuries in France. Chateau de Chambord, which is 20 kilometers away, was built in the same period, a little bit earlier. This is where Joan of Arc went to receive her blessing, we're told. Again, dinosaurs all over the place, and especially in the throne room, you have this beautiful tapestry that dates to the 1200s. And there is it's a dead ringer for Dracorex hogwartia, which was discovered 2007, named for Harry Potter. But it looks like a dragon. The head is very dragon-like, and the restorations were the result of the cause of their saying this is Dracorex hogwartia. It's just so striking, it's just hard to miss. You also see a little duck-billed hadrosaur, the little juvenile hadrosaur, in the corner of that same tapestry. And you compare that with the juvenile hadrosaurs on the internet, you'd think they had that for the model. It's from the 1200s. It's just unmistakable. In fact, after I had made this presentation several times, when I came back the next year, they had cordoned that off, and they were no longer allowing people to see that.
Wow.
They got embarrassed, I guess. I don't know. But there's powerful evidence in France. Now, when we go to places like that, my wife says, you know, I'd like to go with you on this research trip. And we fly into Paris, and that works pretty well.
Little detour, right?
In Cambodia, it's a little different, and we have some dramatic evidence there. I had a tourist guide call me after he had seen one of the presentations on the internet on this temple that was just uncovered to Prom there near Siem Reap in Cambodia. There's a Stegosaurus carved with all of the carvings that cover the walls of these castles. So I got on the plane to go see, and that's the only way you can tell. And sure enough, it's just a beautiful Stegosaurus, tons and tons of limestone wall above it. The temple was built in 1186. The date is on a stele out front in honor of his mother-in-law. But Jayavarman VII, who is one of the best-known temple builders of the Khmer Empire, and they built some of the largest and grandest temples ever built. We know all about them. Has monkeys and various jungle animals, parrots, some of the buffalo But right there amongst all of them is this perfect Stegosaurus. Now, some actually said, well, but the head is not exactly perfect. And of course, that's not the real question. The question is, what would an artist remember? I don't think they had one trained to pose for them. They were remembering it. We did test that at the University of Texas there at Arlington. We went to an art class, and the instructor instructed the students, draw me a Stegosaurus. Can't look on the internet or in your books, just draw one. Our Cambodian artist beat every one of them. It's a really good Stegosaurus. From 1186. How did they do that without having seen one? And if they did, then they're not 100 million years apart, and the picture presented in that geologic column is just not right. And when you put together what's in Cambodia and what's in France and what's in Peru and what's in Mexico or what's in Texas, around the world you see all kinds of contradictions. And this picture that we see in the geologic column is not seen anywhere, and that's acknowledged in the textbooks. It's, as the Encyclopedia Britannica says, a mental abstraction. It's a model. Well, models are useful in science. We begin with the thing to be proved and don't consider it as proof. That would be circular logic. But we use it then to test against the real world. And when we test against the real world, the model doesn't work. It is contradicted, not verified. And when we see that, it's time to give up. It may be pretty, and we may have a lot of them in the books, but this does not represent reality. And I think it is a very flagrant contradiction. And they have acknowledged if you find the topsy-turvy fossils, that's the test. Well, it's been tested, and it was falsified.
Sure. You mentioned all these countries, and you also mentioned Texas. Is there significant evidence around all the United States, or is it pocketed in certain places of dinosaurs?
We find the human footprints together in the same layer as the dinosaurs, not necessarily at the same spot. Sometimes they are at the same spot, very dramatically. But in the Cretaceous, that's the time period, if you find human tracks there, then that's of similar significance. We find it up in the northern part of Texas, up near Stinnett, Texas. We found it down near the southern part of Texas, in at least 2 or 3 places. So the middle, the top, and the bottom in Texas. We found in Utah, the Meister track is actually in the Cambrian and certainly appears to be a human footprint. There were 7 others found in the same area that would help confirm that. So yes, I think we find it all over, and I think it's exciting.
Texas is a big state.
Well, yes it is. I've looked more there, and so
Sure.
We've got more evidence, but from top, middle, and bottom is pretty good indication.
How many people like yourself looking for this kind of evidence from your neck of the woods?
There are a whole lot more people trying to figure out a way to answer it
Sure.
than to try to find it.
Correct.
But we have some, and we're finding more evidence all the time, every year. I have a lecture that I have to keep trimming down because I could keep adding more stuff in, or we'd be talking all day.
Fully understood, and yet it continues to be nothing but exciting for you. And
I think so.
And a life's path.
Yes, it's very encouraging, and to continue to find more evidence in Cambodia and in France and in Peru and around the world is just very exciting.
You see that footprint, you believe.
That's good evidence, and that's evidence that the evolutionist acknowledges. If humans and dinosaurs were together, as Richard Dawkins says, it would literally, and I quote, blow the theory of evolution out of the water. That's what Richard Dawkins, the creation hater, says. And I think he's right.
When we conclude in just a moment, we'll try to get to a conclusion about whether evolutionists will see the light in this regard as Beyond History continues. Ken Trahan with Dr. Don Patton. And Don, as we conclude, the old axiom, the proof is in the pudding. If you can prove, or if man can prove, that dinosaur and man were together, it pretty much blows the evolutionists out of the water, doesn't it?
We can list dozens of evolutionists who have acknowledged just that point. If you find that evidence, then that would destroy it, because we don't find that column anywhere. It's pieced together, it's a mental abstraction, it's a model to be tested, and then when we test it, we find it fails. The founders of the discipline of geology, Nicholas Steno, who is a hero. If you study stratigraphy, you got to know all about him. They don't tell you he was a flood geologist. That was his concept. And that concept worked well enough for him to write the rules that we still use today to interpret the strata. It works very well, and I think is completely in harmony with what we see in the scripture, but very different from what the evolutionist tells us.
We'll be looking for further proof to display and to show you, and as we get it, you'll see it. And this guy will have a lot to do with it, I'm quite certain. Dr. Patton, it's been great having you with us again.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for the education. I deeply appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's going to do it for Beyond History this time around. Tune in next time as we bring you more on history and faith. Until then, Ken Trahan, God bless you.